This is Interpreting Wine founder and host Lawrence Francis inviting you to my first ever Interpreting Wine Hospitality Summit. This first of its kind audio event takes place from Monday the 28th of September until Thursday the 1st of October and will feature a diverse range of voices from London hospitality. Attendees gain early access to episodes over the 4-day event, and each episode will feature a different figure from the London hospitality scene, sharing stories and practical tips to help you navigate these uncertain times. Signing up will give you exclusive access to show notes for each session, giving you a list of key takeaways and strategies you can experiment with right away. And you will also get access to the Interpreting Wine Hospitality Summit private Facebook group, where you can discuss each session and access behind-the-scenes content. To sign up for this free event, just head to interpretingwine.com/summit. Today's episode of the podcast is a wine production special with winemaking consultant Mike Mazey. A seasoned consultant and educator based in South Moravia, Mike shares his knowledge using the Unit 2 wine production structure for the WSET diploma, focusing first on viticulture and what factors wineries can use to increase quality, before using the same structure for vinification, and lastly, maturation, before leading us through 2 pairs of wines designed to display these characteristics, a younger and a more complex style of Pinot Blanc, and also the same for a pair of Chardonnays, both of which are produced by wineries with which Mike consults, and help to bring to life the techniques which Mike discusses in the episode. As a special bonus, Mike has kindly put together a PDF to accompany the episode, entitled A Comparison of Vineyard and Cellar Techniques for Producing Simple versus Complex White Wines. It's recommended to have this to hand while you listen along, and this file can be accessed at interpretingwine.com/Mazey. Enjoy.
Lawrence, thank you for having me back. It's really great to see you again after a few years. And so many episodes, so congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, since that time, we released the book Wine Words. What I really like about the textbook is that a lot of wine courses have come out of it. So now that the book is done, I have my kind of syllabus in place and all my materials prepared. And so I'm really enjoying teaching some of the students at Mendel University, the university where winemakers train in the Czech Republic, with their wine English, and that's been great. But I suppose probably the reason you're interviewing me today is some of the consulting work that I do for 2 small family wineries. So I consult for Balaž Winery from Dolní Dunavice near Mikulov, which is a border town in the southeast corner of the country, and also Václav Winery from Hustopeče, which is another historic wine town. And I suppose my job is simply to give my recommendations for how to create premium wines from their current selection. So they already have a selection of wines, but they want to introduce premium range. And I suppose a good structure for this is, what do we do in the vineyard? How do we vinify the wine? And then how do we mature the wine in such a way that we can produce superior quality to what they're currently producing? You know, in the past, I've always had a lot of respect for the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. In fact, my textbook is really a bridge for those whose English is perhaps not quite good enough to do the level 3 and level 4 courses in English. And so I suppose a nice structure we can focus on is the structure from the level 4 course, where we focus first on viticulture, then on vinification, and then thirdly, maturation, treatments, and packaging, and how that applies to creating a premium brand from a current portfolio of wines.
Again, it's great to have you back on. As you'll know if you've been listening for a while, Mike was actually the very first interview that I published on the podcast, so way back in episode 9. And for anybody that's been listening attentively along the journey, they'll know just how early that was and just how sort of foundational that was really in everything that's come on. So yeah, it was great to revisit Bernau and great to have you back on again. And I think then since episode 9 really and really finding, I guess, my audience, I know that the episodes really that do the best, that have the most engagement and the people appreciate the most are ones that can support them in really doing better in the WSET diploma. My most listened to episode ever was the one that I recorded with a gentleman called Jim Gore, in which he was talking about the science of blind tasting. And I've recently done also a very successful episode with Anne McHale MW, in which she was tasting a rosé, which was again using the level 4 criteria. But in the forums and in the chats that I've had, there's been requests for slightly different types of content, and I thought, who better really to do an episode and to really put some support out there for people who are attempting the Unit 2 exam and really using your experience, which, as you say, you're now essentially packaging up as a consultant, and it's something you're using on an ongoing basis, and then really sharing some of those insights and some of that experience with my listeners to support them primarily to really do well in that exam.
I suppose I'd like to share with you my consulting process and to split it into 3 sections. The first being what we do in the vineyard, the viticulture behind the wineries that I'm consulting for, and then the vinification, which would be the second part, so the winemaking process. Thank you. And then the third part is the maturation, the treatments and packaging. So we'll start with what happens in the vineyard. And a common problem or common challenge, I suppose, is I come to a winery and they want to produce a premium wine that might cost between $18 and $20. From the same vineyard that also produces, let's say, a more entry-level wine or a more classic style that might cost $10 to $12. So how do you create that difference from the same fruit? And that's quite a challenge, actually. So I suppose I start by asking, is there a particular parcel in the vineyard that seems to consistently produce better quality grapes? And if so, can we reserve that for the better quality wine, naturally? That seems very obvious. I know it seems very basic, but certainly growers who know their vineyards well know that perhaps they have a patchwork of soils, and that certain soils seem to consistently deliver healthier, riper grapes year in, year out. So identify that section, keep it separate for the premium wine. Or there are some techniques which cost money because they demand more hours in the vineyard, but hopefully should maximize the quality of the grapes. So I'm thinking of 2 particular techniques here. One is related with canopy management, and it's called leaf plucking or de-leafing. Very simple. Usually around veraison, that special time when if you have red grapes, you have 50% purple berries and 50% green berries. You are actually pulling away leaves that will expose the bunches to increased sunlight. So you get the direct effect of that light on the fruit. So you get the maximum ripening possible. And I never, I'm risk averse as a person generally, so I'm never telling or suggesting to my clients to do the whole vineyard, but do a portion, and often do one side of the canopy that receives morning sunlight and not the afternoon, because despite the fact that it often improves quality, you can get sunburn if too much sun falls on the grapes, so it has to be balanced. So that's one technique that I find tends to increase the quality, especially in varieties from the family of grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinot Noir, and Sauvignon Blanc, because they tend to have more of these green characters, these herbal characters, which can be too much if the grapes are not ripe enough. And then I suppose the second technique in the vineyard, which I think helps, is a green harvest or crop thinning. So again, around veraison time, we want the vine to produce the most intensely flavored grapes.
Yeah.
And I've often heard of the illustration of the Christmas tree. If you have a Christmas tree with lots of lights, if you were to switch off some of those lights, the rest of the lights would shine a little bit more brightly. And it's the same kind of concept. You reduce the number of bunches, perhaps to only 6 to 8 bunches. And so what is left will tend to be riper, with more intensity, with better tannin structure, and better potential for aging. So right from the vineyard itself, we're creating a difference that translates into a higher quality wine. I do distinctly remember a very strange exercise from my viticulture professor at university. We would have a wooden stick with holes drilled through it, and then would have a metal probe, and our job as students was to stick this probe through and count how many layers of leaves are there before you get to your bunch of grapes. Because if I can break down the mathematics for you, if you have one leaf shading a bunch of grapes, then on the front side of that leaf you get 100% sunshine, but on the other side you get 10%. And then if you have 2 leaves shading a bunch of grapes, suddenly you only get 1% of the sunshine that you would normally get if the grapes were directly exposed to the sun itself. And sunlight has this amazing impact on ripening the flavors and the tannins in grapes. So it's really essential that you get that direct exposure, if possible, without getting too much, which might cause sunburn. So that's probably my biggest takeaway is finding that balance so that you improve ripening without risking over-ripening. There's a nice phrase in the Czech language. They call the grapes that tend to be removed as martiňáky. It's the grapes that would normally ripen 2 weeks later, and like you're picking them on St. Martin's Day, which is the 11th of November. So if you can imagine, you have the vine and then you have your primary shoot, and from this you have bunches of grapes known as the primary crop. And these are the best. These are where most of the sugar that is photosynthesized in the leaves gets directed so that you ripen the grapes. But occasionally you get very vigorous varieties such as Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Sauvignon, and you get a shoot growing from a shoot. And from that second shoot you get secondary bunches of grapes known as second crop. And ideally, during veraison, where you can see color differences, you'll see some bunches with 50% purple berries and 50% green, and others which are from the secondary shoots being 100% green grapes ripening 2 weeks later. Those are the ones you want to remove so that you have uniformity of ripeness, so that you maximize your quality. As background, I'm really impressed by the way many winemakers, progressive winemakers and grape growers are using cover crops. So between the rows you can grow often mixtures of legumes that they fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and they convert it into a type of fertilizer for the vineyard. And I think if possible, it's great if you can avoid adding synthetic products to the vineyard. I'm not saying that every winery must be organic or biodynamic, just if you can avoid it, why not? And plants, companion plants, are a great way to do that. So, of course, you need to be careful that there's not too much nitrogen in the soil, because when that happens, you tend to get very vigorous growth in the vines, and you tend to get too many shoots and too many leaves and too much crowding. And so you tend to get more disease because not enough air is circulating in the canopy. But if you can find the right balance of this cover crop, usually it's grown in every second row, and then the following year they reverse the order so that those that have just normal grass might get cover crop, and the rows that had cover crop go back to grass. And so you're avoiding having to add synthetic fertilizer in many cases. So we have techniques such as de-leafing or leaf plucking. We have a green harvest. We have the use of cover crops. These are just some of the techniques that can maximize a plot or a part of the vineyard in order to create superior quality grapes. The next section, I suppose, is vinification. So, creating wine from those grapes. And so I come from Australia, where machine harvesting is a really big tool at our disposal, because the rural areas that grow grapes tend to not be populated with too many workers that are available, so machines have to do the work. Here in the Czech Republic, it's actually relatively uncommon to see a machine harvester unless you're a much bigger vineyard. So luckily I'm working with only hand harvesting, which is great. Just a point on the green harvest. One of the things that you have to be a little bit careful with is, because you're reducing the yield of grapes, you're actually creating a situation where your premium wine might even be harvested before your classic wine, because if you have a given number of leaves, and if each leaf is like a solar cell generating sugar, with less bunches of grapes, they tend to ripen earlier. So that's the kind of slightly counterintuitive thing you have to keep in mind. Okay. But in terms of processing with whites, it's kind of classic destemming and crushing. A nice technique here is that any skin contact tends to be done in the airbag press. Most progressive winemakers have fully contained pneumatic presses, and they might put dry ice inside so that you're relatively protected from oxidation. And you might leave your grapes in there for 6, 9, 12 hours, but that's usually one of the steps where you can distinguish between a premium wine, in the case of white wines, and let's say a more entry-level wine. Because with more skin contact, you get more of maceration, you get more tannins and more flavor from the skins. And so you tend to get a less fruity style and a more richer and more complex style. So even at the pressing stage, you're making decisions that will have an impact on the final style. After that skin contact time and after pressing, again, a relatively simple thing here is settling, sedimentation. So you're just pumping that juice into a tank, and you might add a little bit of sulfur just to protect from any unwanted yeast from starting the fermentation. What you're trying to do is create a must that is clarified enough for the style that you're trying to make. So if you want to make a really fruity style, you tend to want to clarify your must as much as possible. You tend to want to give more time, maybe 24 to 48 hours, usually at 5 degrees Celsius, where you're allowing time for those grape particles to settle to the bottom of the tank. So you have a nice clear must. And it's those clear musts that give you the most fruity style of white wines. But again, if you want a more complex and richer style, you can simply reduce your settling time. And so you have a slightly cloudier must, but that tends to give you the richer, more complex styles of wine afterwards. So again, a simple step like settling can have a really, really big impact on the style that you're trying to make. So after settling and then racking off the sediment, then a classic choice that a winemaker makes is, do I add inoculated yeast, or do I let nature take its course and have a natural fermentation? Yeah. Again, I consider one of my mentors to be Fred Leumer from Kamptal in Austria, and he has this nice system where for his best wines he tends to use only natural yeast. And for the more commercial styles, he will definitely use inoculated yeast. And he's not dogmatic about it. If one of the natural fermentations is not going as fast as he would like, he's quite happy to add inoculated yeast to just make sure that the fermentation is completely finished. So I like this approach. I work with wineries who are a little bit worried about that initial step with the fermentation, because it does often take a while for a natural fermentation to really get going. And while that's happening, you are risking some oxidation. And so what a lot of winemakers do is they'll pick a bunch of grapes. They'll pick some grapes and make, 50 litres of must. They'll do that a few days before so that they've actually got an actively fermenting part so that they can add immediately and initiate the natural fermentation. So, it's amazing to think that this is perhaps one of the biggest differences between a more complex style and, let's say, a more commercial style, is your choice of yeast. I personally love the fact that a natural fermentation allows you to have so many different yeast have an influence and have an impact on the wine itself, whereas if you're introducing a single yeast that tends to dominate the fermentation, then you tend to get more simple, fruity styles of wine. So I mean, if possible, I always prefer a natural fermentation. Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things that I think is really interesting here in the Czech Republic is that we're going through a period where people are learning more about wine. And so in the past, when people tasted the flavour of oak, they were actually put off. They thought, this is too much of a manipulation of this wine. And I think as people grow in their knowledge of different styles of wine from around the world, they're starting to appreciate the influence of oak. And so definitely I try and encourage my producers to ferment in new oak barrels if possible. For their white wines, for their red wines, not fermenting in the barrel for red wines, but definitely for white wines. What I love about this process is the integration and the harmony that you get. If you ferment in a stainless steel tank and then mature the wine in a barrel, you tend to get a kind of disjointed structure to the wine, whereas by fermenting and maturing in that new barrel, you tend to get the richness of the new oak flavour, the lovely nutty, creamy vanilla characters. But it's not so overpowering. It's not like hitting you in the face and kind of knocking you over. Yeah. So I think the best way to get harmony is to ferment in the barrel. And then, again, after the fermentation is finished, one of the things that I'm starting to learn, especially from the Austrian winemakers, is leaving the wine on its gross lees, something that as an Australian winemaker was completely foreign to me. But what I love about this process is you're delaying the need to add sulfur for as long as possible. Generally, the wines that you leave on gross lees without sulfur will go through their own malolactic fermentation, so that will naturally follow. And the great thing is the bacteria that convert the malic acid, the green acid of Granny Smith apples, into the softer, creamier lactic acid of milk, they have so much food to eat with all those gross lees that there's usually never a problem to finish your malolactic fermentation in that same barrel. And that all happens, and one of the things that we'll try with one of the wines we'll taste later is that the wine spent 7 months without sulfur, which is something almost unheard of in Australia. But because it was on gross lees, those lees created protection against oxygen, because even when yeast cells die, they have this ability to scavenge oxygen from the wine, so you don't have to add sulfur. And it's my experience that the longer you can delay the addition of sulfur, the more complex the wine becomes. So that for me was a kind of revelation in my own thinking about wine. And it really helps if you have cellars, natural cellars, which tend to become much colder during winter. So if you have cellars that are not so insulated, they can easily get to 8 degrees over winter, and they start to warm up in spring. And it's usually February, March where we're adding sulfur to the wine. And during that time, again, another choice is limited batonnage, so stirring of those lees, but not too much so that we don't want the wine to develop too quickly in the barrel. But then just leaving the wine sur lie or on lees such that the yeast have the chance to impart character and provide that protection from oxidation. So, I mean, I love the way Central Europeans use yeast in their winemaking. And that's something that, as an Australian winemaker, I've really appreciated from living here. And I suppose perhaps one of the things that I try and encourage all of my clients to do is create a tripod of components, if you like. I think the minimum number of different components of wine that you need to create a blend that is balanced is 3. I usually go for the heart of the blend being this, rich wine that's been fermented in oak, that's had malolactic fermentation, that has this influence from oak. But I like to see wines from stainless steel tank showing that kind of fruity character and showing really good freshness and crisp acidity. And then I like to have something in between, either older oak or larger oak barrels, or perhaps a stainless steel tank where we were also performing batonnage or lees aging. So having at least 3 components that you can blend later to create your premium wine, I think, is really, really important. What I should have said is that we're definitely going into the third section now. We're going into the maturation of the wines. Yeah. I've always been taught that your job as a winemaker is to create components which are quite different from each other. And there are so many ways to do that. Some people do that by picking early, middle, and late in the season. That's not my favorite technique, although that's been done a lot for Sauvignon Blanc. I tend to prefer other methods, especially when you're dealing with a variety like Chardonnay, which has such a beautiful affinity for oak. I like to play with the influence of oak, the influence of yeast, and the more fruit-driven styles of wine in stainless steel with inoculated yeast and with very clear musts. So if you can bring those components together and play with the blend, then I think you get the best of all possibilities if you can get that ratio correct. And then you can make a wine that hopefully is more complex, is more age-worthy, and is more prestigious in the mouth and in the bottle. Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, I think, as I say, this episode, I think, is really going to help a lot of people who are preparing for that Unit 2 exam. And I think, hopefully this is something that they can sort of play back, revisit, and almost check in with their own knowledge, their lectures, what they read, what they taste, and I think build those connections. And very kindly for me and future for the listener as well, you've chosen 4 wines, I think, to really kind of bring what you've just spoken about there to life. But I don't want to kind of steal your thunder, so I'll let you set up these 4 white wines that are in the glass.
Yeah, so we have 2 pairs of wines in front of us, and I suppose, as I said from the beginning, how do you go through that process where you have one vineyard and yet you want to produce a wine for $10 to $12 as compared to a more premium wine costing $18 to $20? So what is the process? And I think you hopefully can see some definitive results in the glasses in front of us. Yeah. The first 2 wines are Pinot Blanc from Václav Winery, so they're a small family producer near the town of Hustopecha. In the first Pinot Blanc from 2019, it's a wine that has only seen stainless steel tanks. We inoculate with a slightly fruity but not overtly fruity yeast because we want fruity characters. We want consistently cool temperatures between 15 and 18 degrees. And we want a clear must so that fruitiness is brought to the fore. And then the second Pinot Blanc is an older 2018. So same vineyard. There was a green harvest performed. The must was cloudier, so there was less settling time. It was fermented and aged in new French oak barriques, and it was kept for 5 months on gross lees without any sulfur. And so what I'm feeling when I taste these wines is generally a quite aromatic style of Pinot Blanc. I struggle with this variety. At least in Australia, it was always the poor cousin of the more aromatic grapes such as Riesling and Sauvignon Blanc. And it tends to produce relatively neutral styles, although I have to say that Pinot Blanc for me has now become one of my favourite Czech white grape varieties because it can be very expressive. So I'm getting that kind of honeyed apple and straw character and beautiful refreshing acidity, whereas the wine on the right, I'm getting this what I feel to be intensely lifted vanilla, nutty and creamy characters from new oak and from batonnage and from aging on gross lees. And I think it's quite obvious character at the moment, which some people might downpoint the wine for, but I'm confident that with time that character will become more integrated and more part of the wine itself.
And just to say as well, and I guess sort of set you up to kind of explain these a little bit more, I do believe that the evolution really of these two lines were as a direct result of them engaging you and applying the recommendations that you brought to them.
Yeah, absolutely. A very common sight that you see in Moravian cellars, these large Slovenian oak barrels. Yeah, very decorative and very beautiful and very old and very nice. I think they still have a lot of benefit in terms of producing a less reductive environment than a stainless steel tank. But perhaps the biggest change that happened to the cellar after I joined the team was lots more new French oak barriques, especially given the volume. The winery produces 25,000 bottles a year. It was much more flexible to have smaller volumes to play with, because if you have a large component of something, your possibilities are reduced. And I'm all about introducing different components that you can blend together afterwards in order to create a good result. So based on what we're tasting here, we probably had 4 components to play with, and it was really about adjusting the ratio of each of those components to create the different styles that we're seeing. And an interesting point for those who might be fascinated by the process of blending, we thought that the first wine was not complex enough. It was very fruity and very simple. I think it's a little bit more complex now, but during the blending process we played with 3%, 2%, even 1% of an oaked component, and we were very surprised that just 1% of an oaked component to this largely unoaked Pinot Blanc made a world of difference to the quality. Like if I was judging these wines blind, that 1% addition would probably give the wine an extra 3 or 4 points in a 100-point scoring system. It was really quite dramatic. Just that 1% difference in the components was dramatic. Okay, so we move on to the second pair of wines. We have 2 Chardonnays from the Balaž winery, which is, again, a small family producer, 5 kilometers to the town of Mikulov, which is a historic wine town on the border of Austria and South Moravia. The 2 Chardonnays, one is a 2019 and the other is a 2016. And the 16 is the more premium wine. It actually has the name Tannowitz, which is the German historic name for the Czech town of Dolní Dunajevice. So our premium brand for this winery is called Tannowitz. And I love cooperating with this family. They're really hardworking and very humble people who just want to make the best wine possible. So, I'm lucky as a consultant that they apply so much of what I'm suggesting to them, because the strange thing is I'm paid to give people advice, and and not always is it applied. So it's nice to see a family following some of the suggestions. And I think what we see in this pair is the influence of oak and also time on the final product. Because what I'm finding is that the 2019 Chardonnay, there is a strong oak component there, but it's from older oak. And what I like about the 2016, this was fermented in new French oak, and it was showing that oak quite strongly. But because it's already 4 years old, there's beautiful harmony and there's beautiful kind of sweetness. And I often associate aged white wines with a slightly honeyed character that they develop with time. And so you get that, but then you get that lovely creaminess that comes from extended aging on gros lees. And batonnage and then lees contact. There is always this pressure economically in wineries. Okay, it's a new vintage. What do we do? Do we empty all our barrels so that we have the barrels ready for the next vintage? And I'm glad with this wine that they said no. We want to keep this wine in barrel for as long as possible. So it was aged in oak for 18 months. And so they made that sacrifice in order to maximize the time spent in barrel just to make the best wine possible, which I really appreciate. And I think just one of the things that I'm having to adapt to here in this country is matching the level of impact of oak for each different variety. Because if I apply the same brush to all the different varieties, I'm definitely going to over oak some varieties. So Chardonnay, it's really something that you can add quite a bit of oak to, and it handles it. But Pinot Blanc, I know that I need to perhaps play with different sizes of barrels, different ages of barrels, so that I'm careful not to over oak the wine.
I've learned so much here. I think, again, a huge thank you to you, Mike, for your time and sharing your knowledge here. I do just wonder if you would just say something around availability of these wines. I will, of course, link up all of the wines that we're tasting here in the description. But just being aware that the listeners might not be able to have access to all of these wines, and potentially if they were to want to kind of see those same differences that you've been talking us through here, how might they do that if they didn't have access to these specific wines?
Yeah, Moravians have this wonderful blessing in that they can't make enough of their own wine. They tend to need to actually import grapes and so on. So having said that, I know that quality producers such as Václav and Balaž are always looking for importers. So if anyone would like to import these wines, otherwise I think within Europe it's not a problem to deliver these wines. But if you're tasting at home and you'd like something comparative to try, then perhaps I can recommend the Pinot Blancs from Styria, Austria, or from Alto Adige in Italy. And if you somehow have a younger, crisper, unoaked style compared to a Pinot Blanc from the same producer if possible, but let's say a reserve style that has some oak aging, then you can really see this beautiful difference between like the purity of the varietal character versus the impact that oak brings to the wine. And then for the two Chardonnays, in Australia, it's quite simple. We tend to label our wines unoaked and reserve Chardonnay. But if you're looking for European examples, then you might go with a Village Burgundy wine. So, it could be Puligny Montrachet or Meursault or something like that, versus, let's say, a Premier Cru Burgundy, a single vineyard. It tends to get more influence from aging in new oak barrels. So if you have those available, then this would be like a similar style of wines that you're trying.
Again, really enjoyed this session and I can't wait to share it. But I do just want to bring this back to you and really think about and talk about your work as a consultant. And I think looking forward, how might a winery know that they need to reach out to a consultant? I mean, just thinking about some of your clients and the way that they reach you, are there sort of themes that you can see developing in terms of when they kind of pick up the phone to you and feel like they need to bring in some expert advice, or is it something that's maybe a little bit more difficult to predict?
One of the best things that I can do as a consultant is make myself unemployed. If I can actually pass on my skills and knowledge to the point where the winery doesn't need me, then I've actually done my job. So I suppose I'm constantly looking for consulting work, because the more I consult with the wineries, the less they need me. And that's great, because I kind of feel that they're taking on board some of the things that I'm teaching them. So I am looking forward to cooperation with many different types of wineries. Generally speaking, your winery has to be of a certain size to justify the costs of employing a consultant, but I tend to specialize in taking what's available and producing a premium version of it, so that a winery can expand their portfolio. And usually what tends to happen is that the premium wines become the ambassadors. They're not produced in volume, but they do become like the symbol of the winery, like the flagship of the winery. So that's where I tend to specialize in creating this premium range of wines from an existing portfolio.
Also, I think, given our current situation at the moment in 2020 and our reduced access to travel, I would say, is this also something that you're able to do remotely, where you're able to actually dial in, if you like, to wineries in countries that are quite far away, or that you might necessarily need to go there and actually visit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose it's always better to have face-to-face communication as much as possible. I suppose what the pandemic has taught a lot of businesses is that they can get by on Zoom or Skype or whatever, and a lot of information can be passed on that way. So, yeah, it's not strictly necessary for me to be somewhere, but of course it's always much better to get a real feel for the winery and the vineyards. I mean, ideally speaking, I should be there as much as possible from the beginning, and then after our cooperation, a lot of it can be done remotely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your time. It was brilliant to hear you take us through all of those different techniques, and then also talk about how they show up in the glass. As mentioned, using the PDF in conjunction with styles of wines that you can find in your location will mean that you or your study group can use this episode to help you prepare for the Unit 2 exam. I've left below details of Mike's email address and also the book which he co-authored, Wine Words the Book. And if you're not already, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.